Good afternoon, and welcome to our series of events celebrating NATO's 75th anniversary and the member states of the Alliance. My name is Bogdana Turbina, and I am Chief of Staff of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable, non-governmental organization dedicated to informing Canadians about the value, security, and the importance of NATO and Canada's collaborative alliance dedicated to maintaining mutual defense and peace. As part of Canada's contributions to maintaining peace, we connect with our allies today to have a discussion about the upcoming Washington summit and US-Canada engagement on security with today's special guest, His Excellency David Lewis Cohen, the US Ambassador to Canada. I'm honored to join the discussion together with our chair, Honorable David Collinet, as well as Apostol Zezos, the event coordinator team lead, and Arjun Singh Yanglam, the engagement coordinator team lead, two key members of our team at the NATO Association of Canada. After some prepared questions, we will be opening the floor to questions from our live YouTube audience. So if you're watching right now, please start typing your questions in the chat below. Before I pass it on to Mr. Collinet to introduce Mr. Cohen, I should remind you all to subscribe to our NATO Canada YouTube channel and to join our membership in supporting Canada's role in NATO and the rules-based international order. With that, Mr. Collinet, I invite you to introduce Ambassador Cohen.
Well, thank you very much, Bogdana. Ladies and gentlemen who are watching, it's a pleasure to be here with Ambassador David Cohen. The American ambassador is such an important position in all countries around the world, but certainly here in Canada, our closest friend and neighbor, to get the ambassador is a real honor. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce him. He's originally a native of New York City, as I believe it, but has a lot to do with Pennsylvania, where he's lived for many years and went to university at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was a partner with one of the biggest American firms, one of the top 100, and then was an executive with Comcast. So he's been involved with the corporate world at the highest levels. But he also was, he knows a lot about politics. He was chief of staff to Ed Rendell, who was the mayor of the city of Philadelphia, who had an outstanding reputation during his time in office. And so the ambassador, I'm sure, learned a lot of political dealing with political issues and having political insights from that time. He's been involved with the arts, with the community, the sesquicentennial, I can't pronounce it, the commission, pardon my language, in the United States. And he was a logical appointment for President Biden to submit to the Senate. And, we often hear about divisions in Congress, as we have in all parliaments, in our parliament. But I understand that Ambassador Cohen was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. Now, that tells you something about the man, the quality, the individual, and who we have with us today. So, Ambassador, welcome. And we look forward to hearing your insights on issues affecting NATO and especially the 75th anniversary of NATO.
Well, David, thanks very much for that really generous introduction. And it is good to see you again. We were joking. I think we've only seen each other 3 times in the last 24 hours. This time they had to separate us and put us, allow us to only meet virtually. But I do appreciate the introduction. I appreciate your friendship. And particularly today, I appreciate your leadership of the NATO Association of Canada. I'm also grateful to join with everyone who is participating in this call today to celebrate NATO's 75th anniversary and to look forward to the upcoming Washington summit. So for 75 years, NATO has stood as a beacon of stability, security, and shared democratic values. This alliance, which importantly is a defensive alliance, wasn't an inevitable outcome, but resulted from deliberate choices by generations of leaders who recognized our strength in unity. And this unity has been the bedrock of our shared success and the foundation of our collective security across the Atlantic. One of the United States' greatest strengths lies in our alliances, and NATO is the clearest example of how our allies serve as force multipliers. The recent additions of Finland and Sweden to NATO bring two vibrant democracies and highly capable militaries into the NATO fold. As President Biden has emphasized, NATO is stronger, NATO is more energized, NATO is more united, and NATO is more prepared than ever before to keep the peace, deter aggression, and defend freedom all around the world. As you all know from Secretary General Stoltenberg's speech just yesterday, the upcoming July Washington summit will highlight NATO's real-world value by addressing three key priorities: strengthening deterrence and defense, supporting Ukraine, and building global partnerships, especially in the Indo Pacific. In recent years, NATO has faced new challenges, but none more pressing than Russia's aggression against Ukraine. This is the alliance's most urgent current effort, and NATO's response has been resolute. The NATO and a United States-led coalition of more than 50 countries are standing strong with our Ukrainian partners. At the summit, the allies will reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine and continue our close collaboration to build a bridge to Ukraine's future membership in NATO, including through NATO's leadership for Ukraine's security assistance. NATO has a long history of promoting peace and security by engaging in 40 active global partnerships spanning countries on 5 continents and international organizations all over the world. Cooperative security is an essential way for NATO to adapt to modern global challenges and enhance our ability to address those challenges, from maritime security to cyber threats and supply chain resiliency to climate change. Simply put, we know that our security is no longer regional, it's global. And this year, we will again welcome the European Union and our Indo Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand, to the summit as we deepen our practical cooperation and strengthen our vision of peace, security, and prosperity in these two deeply interconnected regions. The Washington summit will also address NATO's core business, deterrence and defense, by advancing the implementation of NATO's most robust defense plans since the end of the Cold War. These regional plans define how the alliance will defend areas of NATO territory, replacing the alliance-wide defense plan. They cover 1, the Atlantic and European Arctic, 2, the Baltic region and Central Europe, and 3, the Mediterranean and Black Sea. These plans are essential for strengthening our collective deterrence and defense capabilities, ensuring that we are prepared for peacetime, crisis, and conflict in the future. NATO's power lies not only in the collective strength of its members, but also in the deterrent effect of our steadfast pledge. An attack against one ally is an attack against all. In Washington, the allies will demonstrate our unwavering commitment to Article 5, ensuring the protection of every inch of allied territory. This sacred commitment makes us safer and provides the United States, Canada, and our allies with an unparalleled bulwark of security. And the allies are sharing the burden of this collective defense more than ever before. A record number of allies are meeting or exceeding the 2% of GDP defense spending benchmark, with 23 allies out of 32 on track to meet the pledge by the end of 2024. Since the Defense Investment Pledge was made in 2014, when, by the way, only 3 allies would have met the pledge, European allies and Canada will have added more than $600 billion for defense by the end of 2024. Our discussions at the Washington summit will include a continued push for defense investment to ensure that every member of this alliance has a credible plan to meet the mark of investing at least 2% of its GDP in its own national defense. As you can see, while we celebrate NATO's 75th anniversary, we are also intensely focused on the future. Together, we will continue to adapt and evolve to meet the challenges of the 21st century. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion, which will follow immediately. Thanks.
Thank you for the opening remarks, Ambassador. As you mentioned, NATO has celebrated its 75th anniversary this past April 4th. How has NATO evolved over its 75 years? And what is the alliance doing to meet the demands of the current threat environment?
So one of the great strengths of NATO has been its ability to evolve, not to remain stuck in a moment in time when NATO was created. So over the decades, NATO has continuously adapted to address the evolving challenges that confront its members, which demonstrates its strength, unity, growth, innovation, and enduring resilience. The threat environment in which we're all functioning today is fundamentally different than it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and when NATO was created 75 years ago. And NATO has had to evolve to meet those new threats. I think the hallmark of NATO, however, is that as threats have evolved, NATO remains as unified and united as ever. The historic enlargement of the alliance these past 2 years, with Finland and Sweden joining, strengthened NATO and our collective ability to defer and to defend. So this 75th anniversary is something to celebrate, and it gives us an opportunity to reflect on the value of NATO, the growth of NATO, and the importance of NATO in preserving democracies globally. As I look to the state of NATO and its 75th anniversary, I think of 32 members of NATO who have every right to be enormously proud of the alliance we've created, that we'll continue to support, where we'll continue to adapt and continue to provide the most effective defense of democracy of any alliance in the world.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, what are some of the priorities for the United States for the Washington summit?
So I think I've highlighted the 3 themes, if you will, thematic priorities for the summit. But from the United States perspective, we want to use the summit to allow NATO to advance the implementation of the alliance's most robust defense plans since the end of the Cold War, strengthening our collective deterrence and defense for peacetime, crisis, and conflict. So today, as I said in my opening remarks, NATO is bigger, stronger, and more united than ever. But in order to demonstrate NATO's role in defending our future, the Washington summit, we're going to reinforce 5 elements. First, our ironclad commitment to Article 5 and defending every inch of Allied territory. Second, Allies' enduring commitment to burden sharing, highlighting remarkable progress by the Allies individually and collectively towards spending at least 2% of each country's GDP on defense investment annually and increasing collective efforts to strengthen our defense industrial base. Third, Ukraine's deeper integration with NATO. Fourth, a clear-eyed recognition of the links between Euro-Atlantic and the Indo Pacific from a security perspective. And finally, we're going to resolve to remain the world's most complete and enduring alliance.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So my question would be, what outcomes does the United States hope to achieve in regard to Ukraine at the Washington summit? Like, are there any discussions about Ukraine's potential accession to NATO, or is there an emphasis on increasing military aid? So how might domestic political challenges impact these goals?
So NATO has a long history of promoting peace and security by working with partners beyond the North America area. And I think that'll be one of the focuses of the summit as we invite numerous non-NATO allies to participate and to join us in the summit. Today, NATO has more than 35 active partnerships spanning countries on 5 continents and international organizations all over the globe. This is going to be the 3rd NATO summit in a row with the IPP and NATO allies meeting at the highest levels. And as the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, developments in one region directly affect security in other regions as well as the Atlantic. As I noted, certainly one of the major priorities is going to be a firm, public, and irrevocable commitment to stand with and support Ukraine. I think you will hear a lot about that during the course of the summit. I think I do get asked every once in a while, why this focus on Ukraine? Why does the United States focus so much on Ukraine? Why Canada? Of course, my easiest answer to that is that Ukraine is fighting this horrific illegal invasion by Russia, and they're certainly fighting for themselves and very courageously, but they're really fighting on the front lines of preservation of democracy against autocracy around the world, and for that, they are really fighting a battle for us. And it is the least that we can do, since they are putting their people, their bodies, their lives, their country on the line to provide every element of security that we can possibly provide. So the United States remains committed to NATO's open door policy, and we're expecting to announce a set of initiatives at the summit this summer that will form Ukraine's bridge to eventual NATO membership. Right now, though, our focus is on helping Ukraine succeed on the battlefield and ensure that the Ukrainians are able to defend themselves now and over the long term. The president has repeatedly stated that the United States will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We just recently signed a bilateral security agreement with Ukraine on the margins of the G7 summit just last week. That agreement is a milestone moment in the United States-Ukraine partnership and a real marker of our commitment, not just for now, but for many years ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador. And as you mentioned during the summit, the partners from the Indo Pacific, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand leaders will be gathering for the summit. And enhancing the alliance's partnerships is one of the priorities. There has been an increase of engagement between NATO and the Indo Pacific partners. And my question is, what role is the United States playing in this increased engagement? And what will be the role of the Indo Pacific in the context of the summit?
Well, as you noted in the question, we have invited, and as I mentioned in my remarks, we've invited our Indo Pacific allies who are not members of NATO to participate in the summit. So they will be at the table with us. They will be participating in our discussions of the importance of global security and of a global defense of democracy. And in terms of the United States, we have had an Indo-Pacific strategy and a commitment to advancing peace and security in the Indo-Pacific for many years. And this is just a natural continuation of the United States' commitment to the Indo-Pacific. Canada is an interesting country. It is like the United States. It is both an Atlantic and a Pacific nation. And Canada more recently, last year, issued its own Indo-Pacific strategy, demonstrating Canada's commitment to the Indo-Pacific. And really over the years, NATO and the Indo Pacific have developed a shared positive agenda to address challenges that are common to both the Indo Pacific and the Euro Atlantic regions. And our cross-regional challenges, just to give you a sense of the commonality of interests, include cyber defense, emerging and disruptive technologies, maritime security, nuclear proliferation, climate change, supply chain resiliency, and countering disinformation. So I think all those elements will be on the agenda at the summit as we continue to deepen our partnership with the Indo-Pacific nations in defending ourselves in the Euro-Atlantic, but also in the Indo-Pacific, and in pursuing democracy and freedom on a global basis.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would just like to remind our audience that you're more than welcome to leave any questions for the Q&A in the YouTube live chat. And with that, I would like to proceed with a question that you had mentioned, an answer to previously a little bit. So record number of allies, we've noted 23, have exceeded the 2% benchmark that was agreed upon in 2014. But some, including Canada, are not meeting these commitments agreed to by the allies, even at last year's Vilnius summit. So with that, I wanted to ask, how is the United States working with allies on burdening, on this burdening share?
So I think as certainly one of the principal leaders of NATO, and we're all partners, allies, and equal in that sense. But I think the world does look to the United States for leadership, and we certainly are a major proponent of the importance of burden sharing in NATO. We continue to urge all allies to meet their Wales Pledge commitments, to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. I always note when I talk about this, particularly with respect to Canada, this is not a standard that's being imposed on any country. It is not something the United States insists that Canada or Poland or Germany must spend at least 2% of its GDP on defense. These are commitments that each country made its own judgment that spending 2% of its GDP on defense was important to commit to, and as you noted in the prior question, reiterated that pledge in Vilnius. And I would note in Canada's case that when the president visited Canada in March of 2023, Canada again reiterated its commitment to honor its Wales Pledge and spend 2% of its GDP on defense. So we continue to, like other countries in NATO, other allies in NATO, we continue to urge all countries to meet their 2% of GDP Wales commitments. I feel compelled to say, however, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting in Canada talking to a Canadian organization, that we prefer, we the United States, and certainly I as the US ambassador to the United States, prefers to look at Canada's commitment to defense as being more complicated and more nuanced than it's meeting any one single metric. And we look at things like trajectory of spend. How's Canada's defense spending looking? And Canada's defense spending has grown enormously. In this year's budget, which the first bill of which was actually passed yesterday, the Department of Defense budget is up 27.5%. And an overall budget, by the way, with a 3 to 5% increase in the budget. And if you look at where Canada was, and this is what Mr. Stoltenberg mentioned yesterday in his speech, when the Wales pledges were made, Canada was nowhere. They were well under 1% of their spending of 1% of their GDP on defense spending. So Canada's had a longer way to go than most other countries, including the United States. But beyond numbers, we look at Canada's responsiveness, Canada's ability to respond to NATO and defense priorities. So we look at Canada's Indo Pacific strategy, which I mentioned in response to the previous question. We look at Canada's robust NORAD modernization strategy and the substantial commitments that Canada has made to improving continental defense and in particular improving defense in the Arctic. We look at major investments that Canada is making in next generation aircraft and armaments. Again, something that Mr. Stoltenberg mentioned in his remarks yesterday. Purchase of the F-35s, the purchase of P-8s. And we look at Canada's responsiveness on the world stage. When NATO and the world called for support of Ukraine, Canada is one of the largest supporters of Ukraine in the world. When we called on Canada for assistance in Haiti, Canada has stepped up as the next largest supporter of the MSS force that's being deployed in Haiti after the United States. So Canada's been there. And we need to assess Canada's defense commitment by reference to all of the ways in which Canada has stood up, not just by where it lies on a chart in terms of the percentage of its GDP that it spends on defense. All that said, and I'm not talking out of both sides of my mouth, all that said, it is important that Canada make measurable progress and have a plan to get to spending 2% of its GDP on defense. And you don't have to look at me for that statement. Defense Minister Bill Blair has repeatedly stated that Canada has to do more, that Canada has to spend more, that Canada will have a plan to get to 2% of its GDP to spend on defense.
I totally agree, Ambassador. So beyond military aid, what opportunities do you see for NATO to support Ukraine, particularly in terms of economic assistance and rebuilding?
I love your questions because in case I didn't know the answer to your question, which I think I would have, you prompt me as to exactly what the answer is. I'm a lawyer by training, and if we were in a courtroom and you asked the question, somebody would stand up and say, I object. That's a leading question. Just joking. Look, I think the opportunities for NATO to support Ukraine beyond the military assistance fall into a number of categories. I'd actually start with the moral authority and the moral suasion and the public and moral support that NATO countries provide for Ukraine means a lot. And I've been told by the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada that I probably don't understand how important it is to the Ukrainian people when Prime Minister Trudeau, when Foreign Minister Joly, when Secretary Blinken, when President Biden visit Ukraine and show up and thank the Ukrainian people for their courage and for their being on the front lines against this horrific, illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the power of the bully pulpit, the power of making sure the Ukraine and Ukrainians appreciate, know that we appreciate their being on the front lines, I think is an essential NATO role. And then the second category I would reference is going to be the important role that NATO countries play in the rebuilding of Ukraine once this conflict is completed and Ukraine has been victorious. This will be a Herculean task. And there are probably not many people on this call, and I'd be in that category too, who remember firsthand the tremendous rebuilding effort that was necessary after World War II. And it was a multi-year, multi-decade effort to be able to restore Europe and Japan for that matter, but principally Europe to its former state, infrastructure, economy building, restoration of businesses, rebuilding of morale. That will be a Herculean task, and it will be a task where where the 32 countries of NATO will play a leading role and will make the difference between a successful rebuild and an unsuccessful one.
Thank you, Ambassador. I wanted to circle back a little bit to your mentioning of the emerging disruptive technologies, EDTs, and the partnership on these technologies that you've mentioned with the Indo Pacific. And just for our audience, the emerging disruptive technologies include things such as the artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced biotechnology, which is going to transform our industries and societies in the future. Ambassador, I wanted to ask you, what role does the United States envision playing in fostering international collaboration and regulatory frameworks to ensure that these technologies are developed and deployed responsibly while also maintaining a competitive edge on the global stage?
So I'm confident that by that question, you did not mean to start an entirely new discussion with its own hour, which would be inadequate to address all the issues involved with the development, the manufacture, and the protection from all these disruptive technologies. It's one of the most pressing issues that I think we face in the world today. And I mean, taking artificial example as the granddaddy of all of those examples, I'm not aware of anything in my lifetime that has had the potential for good as artificial intelligence has had, for improving efficiency, productivity, for dramatically turbocharging our capacity to calculate, compute, and to change the world for the good. I am also not aware of a technology or something in my lifetime that has had the potential for risk and for harm, as artificial intelligence does if deployed improperly and ineffectively. And the trick, the secret sauce to getting the benefits of these disruptive technologies and protecting against the negatives and the risks is to figure out the right balance. And you use the word regulation. I come from a background where I've spent most of my career arguing, advocating, studying, analyzing how you quote unquote regulate the internet, which is another 20, 30 years ago major disruptive technology. And those debates always centered around how do you regulate just enough to protect consumers and the public, but don't regulate so much that you deter innovation, that you remove incentives for the private sector to invest, to innovate. And in the internet, the United States was able to fashion a well-negotiated regulatory scheme that was called light regulation. And that is the effort the United States is engaged in now on artificial intelligence, and is trying to lead in the world, which is to determine the right level of regulation that does not interfere with the huge investment cycle that is going to be necessary to bring these technologies to the forefront. We, in the United States, we started with an executive order, President's executive order, that has dozens and dozens of action items, which are being implemented and executed every day, every week. We developed a self-regulated industry code of conduct, which is in place, and we're studying the impact of that industry self-regulation, see what's working, what isn't working, making sure that it's not interfering with the investment cycle, and engaging our partners and allies around the world, frankly, first and foremost, Canada, in partnering in the development of these common approaches that both protect against risk, but do not interfere with investment and the technological advances of these disruptive technologies.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So as you very well know, that disinformation has become this significant challenge globally, undermining democratic institutions and even social cohesion. So what strategies and initiatives is the United States prioritizing to combat disinformation, and how would you say it's working with international partners to address this issue effectively?
So if there were a perfect answer to that question, the world would be a much better place. But with all the attention on disinformation, and everybody agrees on its destructive impact, and how it is a potential significant underminer of democracy and of free speech, no one's really come up with the perfect solutions to that yet. So again, this is something where international cooperation between governments and the private sector, cooperation between governments, the private sector in the United States, in Canada, and around the world, and other countries is absolutely essential to try and gain a common understanding, to try and identify causes and roots of disinformation, and to ultimately see whether there are regulatory approaches that can even combat disinformation. I have a view that some have described as naive, so I can't really disagree with that. My concept is rooted in my passionate personal belief in the First Amendment, that everyone does need to have the right to express their views, and the importance of distinguishing, by the way, between misinformation or inaccurate information and disinformation. So, in my statement about the value of democracy, how it is the best form of government, how proud I am of America as the world's leading and most enduring democracy. People in Russia may disagree with that. They may think, or China, they may disagree with that. They may think that a more authoritarian form of government is more efficient. It's fairer to poor people. But my touting democracy, the United States touting democracy, that's not disinformation. That's expression of an opinion. And we have to figure out how, when we get to this, we have to figure out how to regulate disinformation, which I would define for this purpose as malicious manipulation of false and inaccurate information, with a design of accomplishing nefarious objectives. That's something that's worth getting your arms around and trying to regulate. But it is complicated because, as I said, one person's disinformation could be another person's truth. And distinguishing between those two is extremely complicated and sensitive.
Thank you for your responses, Your Excellency. With that, we bring our moderated discussion to a close, and we will now open the floor to any questions from the audience. So I'll begin by reading our first question here from Annie. She mentions, with all NATO countries providing support needed to Ukraine, why has Ukraine not won this fight against Russia yet?
So the short answer to that question is a little bit looking at the baseline. So you have to start with where Ukraine was at the beginning of this conflict and where Russia was. And I think the conventional wisdom was that Russia is one of the world's leading powers in terms of its military force, its purportedly almost unlimited supply of military equipment and military weapons, a vastly larger military force in terms of personnel. And if you think back to the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the conventional wisdom, the reporting in most of the press was that Russia was just going to overrun Ukraine. And I think all the support that NATO allies and others around the world has provided to Ukraine has enabled Ukraine to very effectively hold off Russia, to push them back at times, and it has effectively begun to level the playing field a bit by providing Ukraine with the weaponry and the ammunition that it needs to fight a fair fight against Russia. Well, it may have turned out, by the way, that Russia is not the formidable world power that everyone thought that they were. They still have a lot of people, and they still have a lot of weapons, and they still have a lot of planes and a lot of tanks, more than Ukraine does against a vast border and a vast area of land that is in play in this conflict. And that will remain a significant Russian advantage, which is why it is all the more important for NATO allies to continue to provide financial and in-kind military support to Ukraine. But it is all about leveling the playing field.
Thank you, Ambassador. With that, I wanted to ask a following question. Also, Mr. Cohen, if you would like to respond as well, we'd welcome your responses at any time as well. The next question is from Victoria, and she brings back a response to an answer that you had previously, which was, the U.S. has advocated for a bridge approach to Ukrainian NATO membership rather than the irreversible path that Jens Stoltenberg has described. Can you perhaps speak on the U.S. stance towards Ukrainian membership more in depth, and the potential cautions against committing to an indefinite adoption of Ukraine into NATO?
So I think the United States and all of NATO is pretty committed to admitting Ukraine to NATO when the time is right to admit Ukraine to NATO. While you're in the middle of a war, not even sure Ukraine is capable of honoring its obligations to NATO. And so what Victoria describes as a bridge approach is making sure that we're creating a clear pathway for Ukraine to become a full member of Ukraine. It's not a deferral, it's not a delay, it is putting in place the groundwork to make sure that NATO can admit Ukraine promptly once Ukraine is ready to be admitted, and once Ukraine is ready to discharge its responsibilities as a full member of NATO. So I don't think there's any disagreement. I frankly have not heard NATO advocacy by NATO allies for immediate admission of Ukraine into NATO, because I just think there's a general consensus that the time is not yet ripe to be able to do that. So what we should be doing is making sure we're defining clear rules of the road so that Ukraine knows what it has to do to be admitted into NATO, and make sure we're positioning Ukraine to be successful when it ultimately makes that application.
Thank you. Now, a more pressing question, perhaps, for the upcoming U.S. elections in 2024. Both Victoria and Sasha wonder, with the upcoming U.S. election, what steps should NATO countries take if Donald Trump is elected as the next U.S. president, perhaps safeguards? And could this presidency bring significant changes to NATO, and is this something that we as Canadians should worry about?
So I think I've developed, and David can support me in this because he's heard me talk enough times. I think I've developed a pretty good reputation as being an ambassador who is candid. I didn't turn off I'm sorry, I'm getting a message on the screen. I didn't turn off my video, but I'll turn it on. I think I've developed a reputation as an ambassador who is candid, who is responsive to questions, and who actually answers questions, as opposed to obfuscating and fudging. So I will preserve that reputation, but not by answering the question, because the one thing I am not permitted to do as the U.S. ambassador to Canada. I'm not permitted to do this under U.S. law, is to talk about politics, to speculate about political outcomes, including responding to hypothetical questions about what might happen if the election turned out one way or the other. And again, there's actually a law in the United States called the Hatch Act that prohibits federal employees, and in particular, senior appointed federal employees, and in particular, beyond that, senior appointed federal employees who are confirmed by the United States Senate from engaging in any type of political discussion or political commentary. And even if there weren't a law, I think there's something unseemly about a United States ambassador who is fundamentally in a nonpartisan, non-political position, to be saying anything that would be perceived as taking sides in politics. So rather than try and fudge my way around the question and look like I'm avoiding it, I will at least directly avoid it by explaining why I can't respond to a question like that.
If I may just jump in on that, we have to respect the democratic process, and we respect the democratic process in the United States. Sorry, yes, I have I thought I had my mute on there. We respect the democratic process in the United States in the same way we would we want others to respect our democratic process. I think the ambassador is absolutely right. We have to, if we believe in democracy, we then react with whatever the voters decide.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And with that, I have a question, perhaps reflecting a little bit from yesterday's speech by Mr. Stoltenberg. He was mentioning a lot of the threats other than Russia and some of their allies. And I wanted to ask perhaps on non-NATO members or non-NATO partners that the US and NATO may share, and what are some paths for possible future partnerships that NATO allies have implemented?
Well, the world is a fundamentally very dangerous place today. And look, NATO could be the foremost military and defense alliance in the world. We cover a lot of territory. By the way, with the admission of Finland and Sweden, NATO will have more of a presence in the Arctic, so it's now much more than a European, than a European defense alliance. But look at the Middle East and what is happening in the Middle East. When you look at the Indo Pacific, look at North Korea. It's interesting, as we're having this call about the 75th anniversary of NATO, happens to be the time when there has been the first state visit by Vladimir Putin to North Korea in a very long period of time. And look at the danger of Russia and North Korea aligning. They signed some form of agreement, the whole text of which I don't think has been made public yet. But look at the danger there. Look at the danger in the Straits of Taiwan and China versus Taiwan, the tensions there. Here in Canada, you don't have to think back very many months where Canadian fighters flying in international space in the Straits in Taiwan were being buzzed by People's Republic of China fighters. So it is a dangerous place, and I think the answer to how we protect ourselves is not necessarily an expanded NATO that covers the entire world, but it is the alliances and the commitments that have developed in different regions of the world to address this lack of safety. And NATO, in a sense, is a model and a lead for that type of behavior, and then having like-minded countries collaborate in their collective defense of multiple regions. And I think that's the model that we are using now, and I think it's an effective model, and one unfortunately, we will continue to see deployed as more and more hotspots flare up as a result of the tensions that exist around the world.
Thank you. Perhaps one final question. We can shift a little bit towards Canada, maybe. The U.S. and Canada military forces cooperate on continental defense within the framework of North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, the world's only binational military command. I wanted to ask if you can maybe comment a little bit on the bilateral relations between the United States and Canada, including also their security relations as well.
So that's actually a good positive question to address, and I really mean that. So look, before I came to Canada 2.5 years ago, I always knew we were close allies. I mean, we share this 5,500-mile border, but land border between our two countries. I was well aware of the trade relationship, but I didn't understand the depths of the friendship between Canada and the United States. And I think President Biden said it best when he was in Canada in March of last year, and he said it the same thing before, which is the United States has no better friend, partner, or ally than Canada. No better friend, partner, or ally. And that is true because of treaties that we share. It is true because of our natural affinity, of the comparability of culture and approach. It's true because we're two of the world's leading democracies. It's true because of agreements. It's true because of our mutual commitments to defense and to intelligence. All that is absolute. It's true because of our enormous trade relationship. I've controlled myself. I haven't given you a ton of numbers, but one of my favorite numbers is that the United States-Canada trade relationship results in the movement of more than 3.5 billion Canadian dollars a day in goods and services trade crossing our borders. $3.5 billion a day, creating millions of jobs on both sides of the border. So the closest of our friendship and our relationship comes from all of that. But what really binds us together are the personal relationships and the personal friendships. I can't think of a room that I've been in Canada that has more than 10 people in it, where somebody doesn't come to me and say, my daughter married an American. My next door neighbor's son is dating an American. My cousin's kids are going to an American university. And the opposite is true. My daughter is dating an American here in Ottawa. When my son graduated from college, went to work at a bank in Toronto and met an American, and they're now dating. I mean, these personal relationships, families that have vacation, Canadian families who vacation in the United States every year, Canadian families who vacation in Canada. And of course, my favorite tie is, so I'm from Philadelphia. It's cold in Philadelphia. May not be quite as cold as it is in Ottawa, but it's cold. I don't mind cold weather. But I got a big kick out of the fact that when I came to Canada and I said, well, people said I should be worried about the cold in the winter in Ottawa. And they would say to me, cold, it's no problem at all. There's really no issue with the cold. And so I said, well, how do you deal with it? Figuring they would talk about one of the favorite things, cold is a matter of dressing properly. So I figured they'd talk about their clothes, and they would inevitably say, I spent 3 months a year in Florida. I mean, that, of course, is the ultimate Canada-US tie. Canadians fleeing the winter to go to warm weather climates in Florida, in Arizona, in California. And I say it with a smile on my face, but it would only happen with the enormous comfort level of the personal connections and relationships and similarities of values and culture that exists between the Canadian and the American people.
Thank you, Ambassador. It looks like that is all that we have time for today. You've given us such a great overview of all the pressing issues and the Washington Summit agenda, the changing geopolitical environment, support for Ukraine-Canada bilateral relations. I'm sure that the audience, as well as us and myself especially, have learned a great deal. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Mr. Cohen for some closing remarks.
If I can, David, before you do, I want to compliment you, the NATO Association of Canada, and I've had the chance both yesterday, but in other occasions, to meet your staff and your interns. And I want to thank the interns and your staff for everything they do. This association does a fantastic job. And I know you'd be the first to say that it's because of your whole team. So I wanted to beat you to the punch and thank you for everything you've done, and thank your staff and your interns for the excellent work that they do in promoting NATO within Canada and externally.
Well, Ambassador, you're very kind, because you're absolutely right. We're a very lean, voluntary organization. And if it wasn't for our interns giving support to our president, and the executive team, we wouldn't be able to have the reach that we do, and wouldn't be able to engage with people like yourself. And it's a compliment to us that you have given your time, an hour today, to give some very intricate explanations from the American point of view on NATO, the future of NATO, the summit that's coming up, and how important the alliance is to the world. I go back a long way, and I remember in Parliament in the 1980s, people wondering about President Reagan's rearmament and the building of American defenses, and there was a fear that this was going to escalate world tensions. But I think that the policy then is the same policy now, that only by building your defenses and showing the adversary that you are prepared to meet them, do they come to their senses and say, well, we perhaps should reassess things and put the world arrangements on a more stable footing. And I think one of the things you said today, and the Secretary General said, is that it's very important that we build our defenses, and this, of course, addresses the 2% issue, because we want to prepare ourselves and demonstrate to any adversary, in Russia, others, that we are there as a defensive alliance to protect liberty, freedom, and democracy. And I want to thank you on behalf of the association for spending so much time. Ambassadors are very busy. You in particular, you have established in your 2.5 years, a great reputation, and you're very affable, very approachable, and I think everyone has recognized that today. So thank you for being here, and a few days ahead, but happy July the 4th, happy Independence Day.
Thank you very much, and we really do appreciate the time and the work that you do.
Thank you.